So we had spent a really long time in the book of Luke, being a long gospel, and then we went into Advent in the Advent passages, and then I've been doing some different things since then. We did not finish Luke, but we're right up to the Easter passages. So if you had read your business report, you know that there Luke will be ended, that we'll have done the whole thing come Easter time. But in the meantime, we've been looking at some different books of the Bible. I'll spend the next few weeks in Jonah. And Jonah is a really, really fun book to read. But a lot of us can't quite get past the fish. The fish is something that makes us all wonder, and it's often portrayed as a whale as we see it, because the whales may be the only thing that any of us have seen that can imagine a person being swallowed by and remaining whole instead of being chewed up into a lot of different bites. But one thing that struck me as I've visited different museums here and there and looked at fossils, there are a whole lot of sea creatures that no longer exist. And there are some that we have fossils of. Interesting that sea creature, what we would call sea monsters, great large sea creatures, have been found all over the world. In the U.S., even on the plains of Kansas and on mountaintops, fossils of many different things that we don't see or talk about a whole lot. Interesting one is mosasaurs. I know those fossils get found everywhere. Giant sea creatures, or one that you see in museums sometimes is Predator X, which was one of the largest things that's ever lived in the oceans, that was thought to have gobbled up anything and everything, kind of the apex predator of the ocean. You could write those down and go home and Google them if you want. Mosasaur and Predator X. I don't know what it was that swallowed him, but that's just a detail of the story, not the main point. In the text we see Jonah 1 verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. Now, one thing it doesn't say is why God chose Jonah. We know that he was a prophet. God often uses people when he's the only one that knows why. We see in the Bible God uses who he wants to use, and from our perspective, they're not always the best fit for the job. God uses people to accomplish his work, whether they're into it or they're not into it. The difference between those who want to be used by God find joy in it, and those who don't want to be used find bitterness. It seems in a lot of the stories, background is less important than willingness. God chooses those who are willing, but Jonah makes us wonder, because we know from the story he didn't want to do what was asked of him. Now, we know a little bit about Jonah outside of the book of Jonah. 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 25 mentions Jonah, son of Amittai. The passage tells us how God used Jonah to prophesy that the boundaries of Israel would be restored. And this was done through King Jeroboam, who the text said was evil. It's curious that God used an evil man to accomplish his future plans. Now, he sent him to the great city of Nineveh. Well, what was so great about it? Well, in that time in history, Nineveh may have been the largest city, most populous city on earth during that time. Um, well known in the ancient world. You're probably wondering where it is in the modern day. It's one half of this modern day city of Mosul. That's separated by a river. And Mosul, we've heard of that. We might not know a whole lot about it. It's in modern day Iraq. So the city of Mosul, half of it is the ancient ruins of Nineveh, which was pretty much turned into a garbage dump for a long time, and Mosul's on the other side of it. Now, great city, artifacts have been found there. If you ever find yourself in London, go to the British Museum, and you could see the gates of Nineveh. Giant gates there that are very impressive to look at. You wonder if you're looking at them that these might have been the same gates that Jonah may have looked at and gone through when he went to this great city. British Museum's a fascinating place. I mean, they took stuff. The British military was just taking stuff from all over the world at a time before people thought poorly of doing that as they might now. So, couple of details. So Jonah came from Gath Hefer near Nazareth. Now we all know where Nazareth is, because Jesus came from there. The journey from there to Nineveh was 500 miles. So about like from here to San Diego, if we're going to put it in familiar terms. Verse 3, but Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. So geographically, Tarshish is a port in southern Spain. So a long way, and if you're looking at a Bible map, Nineveh is one direction, Tarshish, southern Spain, the opposite direction. So God was asking him to go 500 miles to Nineveh this way. Jonah went, or was headed, to Tarshish, which was this way, 2,500 miles away. So God asked him to go 500 miles this way. Instead, he was trying to go 2,500 miles the other way. So that's like going from Nazareth region to Tarshish would be more like going from here to Montgomery, Alabama. So, very long way. Now back to Nineveh. Nineveh was a magnificent city. It had walls 8 miles around it. 8 miles of wall around it. Pretty impressive feat there. And if you want to picture the size of it, it's probably all been to San Francisco. It's about 7 miles by 7 miles to go around it. So, good sized place. They were the most powerful city in the Near East at the time, and the Assyrians were known for their cruelty. I remember a history lesson of learning about them when I was in junior high, that they were known to skin people alive and hang their skins on the city wall of their enemies in order to deter other enemies as a sort of scare tactic. And they hadn't been getting along so well with Israel. Assyrian dominance of Israel had been long-standing. King Jehu was forced to pay tribute to Shalmaneser in 841, and the treatment continued until they invaded Israel in 722. So there was some animosity between the people groups. So here it says the word of the Lord. The word of the Lord came to Jonah and told him to go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it because its wickedness had come up before me. We talked about a little bit in Sunday school that sometimes we read the Bible on this side of history and can think about people's disobedience and running from God, like, how could they do that? How could the disciples have such a lack of faith? Kind of thinking, I would never want the Lord to rebuke me for my lack of faith, yet maybe He would. Maybe He would for all of us. But here, the two people groups that had some tension. Now, even if we don't make any analogies, let's just keep it the same. Just imagine for a minute that the Lord asks you to go to Mosul, Iraq, and preach against them. Now, then they had some tension and didn't get along so well with Jewish people, and from what I hear, they don't really like Americans that much in that part of the world these days. So going over may have seemed like it was a dangerous place enough if you're not one of them, but going over there, getting up and preaching against them may have been a little bit more intimidating. Now, what does that look like to go there to preach? They didn't have any churches or synagogues that we know of. Would that be getting up on a soapbox in the middle of a busy street and telling them, preaching against them? When you preach against somebody, it sounds a little bit different than the street preaching that we often hear, the Billy Graham approach, God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. That was not his message. His message was more along the lines of, God has noticed your wickedness and He's going to destroy you unless you turn it around and repent. How's that going to be received? Was he worried about his own safety, we might imagine? But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed to Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. What was going through his mind there in fleeing from the Lord? Well, they seem to have the idea that the Lord, Yahweh, was the God of Israel, not God of the world. Other people had their own gods, be they false gods or wicked gods. And, well, was God out there? Could you get far enough away from Him where maybe He wouldn't see what's going on and maybe forget about you? Maybe if you were that far away, to them it would seem like being on the other side of the world. Well, maybe He'd find somebody else for the mission to keep things more expedient. Well, it wasn't so easy. I mean, we know God's omnipresent. The theological word meaning God is everywhere all the time. Omnipresent. We can't go anywhere to get away from Him. I mean, if we're going to think about it in our world, in our time, where are you going to go to hide from God? Sign up for the space shuttle? Sign up for Elon Musk's journey to Mars? go in a submarine. Submarine's a good way to hide from everybody else, get away from them. There was a lady when I was a kid that she was another school mom, but she would substitute teach for our class sometimes if the teacher was sick or away, and we didn't like her, and we were kind of scared of her in a way. She was mean, and her husband was in the Navy on a submarine crew, and we all had the joke that he signed up for that to get away from her, because that's one place you can't go bother somebody or call them. At least you couldn't in the 1980s, but as far as I know. But here Jonah is trying to hide from God. That's a theme in the Bible, isn't it? Remember? How does the Bible start? Adam and Eve eat of the forbidden fruit, are tricked by the serpent, disobey God, and try to go hide from God. And there it seems like kind of a silly picture. We know that you can't hide from God. Yet he ran away. Ultimately, the story of Jonah is big theme in Jonah is one of obedience. We run away from God in a lot of ways from disobeying God. It's something that all of us do. We go astray. Jesus talked about it a lot with the sheep and the shepherd, and the sheep wandering away and needing to be gathered back up. Isaiah says, all we like sheep have gone astray. We all do this when God asks us to do something, or we know a teaching in the Bible and a command of something that we're supposed to do, and we don't do it. In a way, it's a way of running away from God. It's a way from hiding from Him. It's thinking that, maybe it's a small thing and He won't remember. Verse 4. So Jonah finds a ship bound for a port, going the exact opposite direction. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. We can flee from God, but we can't hide from God, can we? And the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. And all the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. We were talking this morning in Sunday school, working through the passage where Jesus is in the boat with the disciples, and they get afraid. They get afraid of the storm. They think that they're all going to die. And an interesting detail of it, the text right there doesn't spell it out, but we know that Peter, James, and John were fishermen and had probably spent much of their life out there fishing on the sea. And they were afraid, thinking they're going to die. It gets bad. Here, same thing. All of the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. Now, if you're on a cruise, if you're out on a ship, if you're on a fishing boat, if the professionals, the sailors start to panic, then guess what? It's probably time to panic. Like we talked about in Sunday school, it's like if you're somewhere, if you're at the hospital and all the nurses are panicking, probably time to be afraid because they don't do much. So the sailors are freaking out, crying out to their own gods, doing what they could, throwing the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. Now, a lot of ships make money by hauling cargo as well as passengers. So throwing that overboard is really, you think that that's your last resort because you don't want to let go of your cargo because you're going to lose money. You're not going to get paid if you're being paid to deliver that. So you're not going to be paid for that voyage, but you think that it's going to be better to come out alive. At least you'll escape with your life. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. Boy, he's sleeping through that just like Jesus slept through. Just like Jesus slept through the storm. Jonah's down below. Perhaps he's feeling rocked like a baby. But it says he's in a deep sleep. But the captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us, and we will not perish." So it says here, it's interesting in verse 4. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that threatened to break up the ship. God sent the storm. That's interesting. And sometimes God uses storms in a figurative sense to bring people back to Him. You know, it's interesting that how many people find God when things are going poorly and they're scared. A lot of people find God when they're in the hospital and worry that they might not make it. A lot of people turn to God when they're out of options. How many people turn to God when they're at rock bottom and they realize that their choices perhaps got them there and it's not working? God uses storms for a lot of people to bring them to Him in the first place or to bring people back to Him. That's why when evangelism tends to be pretty effective when people are in despair, when people are having a crisis, they're more open to God when they realize that they themselves and their ingenuity can't solve this one. And one thing I see with obedience to God, and I think about Jonah fairly often when perhaps I'm asked to do something hard or God calls me to do something. God's going to get His way, I feel. And do I want to do it the easy way or the hard way? I think most pastors have their moments of things get hard and you fantasize about leaving the ministry and doing something else. And you think, well, how'd that work out for Jonah? He's probably going to put you back where he needs you to be. Verse 7. Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. That's interesting right there. If you're out, say you're out on a fishing boat, and things start getting really rough, everybody's panicking, people are praying, it might not occur to me to wonder whose fault it is. It's a different way of thinking, but I think they knew something was up somehow. So I wonder who's responsible for this? Who's being punished? And they cast lots. Let us cast lots to find out who's responsible for this calamity. And they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So in the ancient Near East, people cast lots. There would be the custom of rolling two painted stones, um, one up and one down. Let's say you put red on one side and black on one side. One red, one black would mean a redo. Two up meant yes, and two down meant no. You see this in the Bible. A lot you see people casting lots, and somehow the Lord using it to give answers to the people. We see the Urim and the Thummim in the temple of being on the high priest's breastplate to be able to sometimes make decisions and inquire of the Lord. Now, be a little bit strange if you're in small group or Bible study. You're talking about a choice, you don't know what to do, and the leader or the pastor gets out the dice. Or we start flipping the coin. We still do that. Sometimes we still flip coins for things. Seldom do we do it, though, as believers to know the will of God or to make big, important decisions. No, we do it more for things like with a football game to see who kicks off first. Yet, God used this somehow. So they asked him. So the lot fell on Jonah. And they would do it a different way. It might be like drawing straws and seeing who gets the short one, or spinning something around to see who it points to. Yeah, so they asked him, it falls on Jonah, so they asked him, tell us who was responsible for making all this trouble for us. What do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you? He answered, I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord. Notice in the text it's capitalized. And that's one of those things when it comes over into English. The capital Lord in the Old Testament is the personal name of God, Yahweh. You also see a lowercase Lord, which is a title of respect. It's Adonai, which means Lord, but that's a lowercase Lord, as it could apply to other people. You know, like having an English Lord, that you would address them as Lord, but sometimes also a title of respect for God. And then you see God, usually the word Elohim, which there were a lot of Elohims or Owls in the Old Testament. You'd see, the Canaanite Elohim, Baal, and the other Elohims around them. So knowing that's sometimes helpful when you see parts of the Old Testament where it's saying like, I am the Lord your God, who brought you up out of Egypt, and you're going from lowercase to uppercase to God. Just a helpful thing to note and understanding it. So basically, I'm Hebrew and I worship Yahweh, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land, the one God. They might have had different ideas. They might have been calling out to dozens of different gods. The God of land, the God of sea, the God of wind, the God of war, the God of fertility, the God of crops. Yet, they were very superstitious people, and verse 11, the sea was getting rougher and rougher. So they asked him, what should we do to make the sea calm down for us? Pick me up and throw me into the sea, he replied. Interesting. Why not just jump over? Pick me up and throw me overboard? Make me walk the plank? Oh. He knew the answer, but he didn't want to do it. He didn't lie either. What should we do to make the sea calm down? So they're saying, like, okay, we drew lots. We know it's your fault. We asked you why. Seems like he probably told them what he did, and they know that his God's causing it. Okay, what do we do? How do we appease your God? Well, throw me overboard. Think about the easier answer. I think there was an easier answer here. Have you ever thought about that? What would the easier thing have been? Turn the boat around. We're going this way. I'm supposed to go to Nineveh. Take me to Nineveh. Take me to Nineveh would have been stating the obvious here. Do we never think of that? Just, hey, turn it around and go that way and all this will stop. No, he really doesn't want to go to Nineveh. Throw me overboard into the violent, raging sea. Let's just end my life here. Seems ridiculous. This is absurd. He really, really, really doesn't want to go that way to Nineveh. He wants to go this way and get far away from the Lord and just be done with it. No. Don't take me to Nineveh, throw me into the sea. I don't want to jump over. Was it that he felt that suicide was going to be a sin, but if they throw him in, then maybe it would be not as bad. Pick me up and throw me into the sea, and it will become calm. I know that this is my fault, and that this great storm has come upon you. Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried to the Lord, 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 please do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased. Seems that these guys are acting more honorable than Jonah here. So they're trying to save Jonah. They're begging God's forgiveness for doing what they want to do. Now, like I said before, it's easy for us to sit back and judge Jonah. Like, God asks you to do something, you do it, right? Yet, this was something hard. This was going to a dangerous place, being from the race of people who he was, going to a violent, warlike people and preaching against them. That had to be hard. But how do we run away from God? By disobeying him in much lesser, easier things. Yeah, we disobey God in plenty of ways. Maybe the most common is, well, sometimes we disobey the Lord from just ignoring him and not seeking him out. Yet, Jonah was asked to do something very, very hard. We can easily judge him for it. And another interesting thing here is you don't see the missionary mandate very much in the Old Testament that we have as Christians. This would have been an unusual request. Nobody seemed to really care that the Gentiles be saved. You see, Jonah wanted God to destroy them. And we see that unfold as the story goes on. And we only see in the Old Testament a few righteous Gentiles, Job being a righteous Gentile in the book of Job, Ruth being a righteous Gentile, Rahab being a righteous Gentile, but there's not too many of them, and it seemed that the people didn't really put too much thought or effort into missionary activities for the Gentile. So it seemed to be an unusual thing in the time that he was asked to do. Verse 15, then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. Man, that would have been a sight to see. You throw him overboard. Did he sit there calmly and they throw him? Was he kicking and screaming? Doesn't say. But he hits the water and the sea grows calm. At this, the men gravely feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. Boy, an interesting opening to this story. They're Gentile sailors. Verse 5, all the sailors were afraid, and each crying out to his own God. So, presumably they're Gentiles praying to a whole bunch of different gods from wherever they came from and the gods that they knew. And here, they're crying out to Yahweh by the end of it, offering a sacrifice to the Lord and making a vow to him. Gentiles, very unusual. Verse 17. But the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Now, that's a metaphor for Jesus and his death and the 3 days before his resurrection. It says here, the Lord provided a fish. And again, we could get caught up in the fish. Is it a fish we know? Is it an extinct fish? Is it a specially made fish for this one time and one time only use? We don't know. Fun to speculate though. But as we get to the end here at chapter 1, not so much a story about the fish, but a story about, well, we see here God's love for all people, even the Gentiles who had been at times enemy of the people of Israel, as they had invaded. Israel had been paying tribute to them, Jonah being disobedient, but I think for us the message is trust and obey. You remember that song? Did most of us grow up hearing trust and obey? For there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. Now, think about it as a kid. It almost seems like it's oversimplifying things, oversimplifying what we're supposed to do. Just trust and obey. But we look at it again and it's not. It's profound. Really, it all comes down to trusting God and obeying him. Yet, easier said than done, isn't it? We all struggle with it. That's why Jonah is a book that's so relevant to us. How much do we trust God? I mean, we have to put our trust in him for salvation, but also that might be the easier part. The harder part might be trusting him day in and day out. Trusting him when he asks us to do something hard. Trusting him enough to obey him when we don't want to. When we don't want to obey his commands. When we don't want to do all the things that he asks of us. And to trust him when life gets hard. To trust him and obey him even when life gets hard. To obey him and trust him when things really aren't going your way. That's a lot of the message here of Jonah. It's a fun story, and it just keeps getting more and more interesting. So stay tuned. I hope you'll join us the next few weeks as we continue to unpack the story of Jonah. But for today, I think we all see a little bit of ourselves in Jonah and the challenge to trust and obey. Now, let's sing a closing song. And while we do, if you'd like to come forward to pray with me for anything, I'll be up here.